All right then. Hello and welcome everyone. It is so nice to see so many familiar names and presumably familiar faces for this, which is our last of these open days for 2022. After this, we'll be taking a lovely long break all the way through until the new year, when we'll be back. Don't know what I'll be talking about yet because I haven't decided, but we'll be back in the same sort of place next year once everything Christmassy and all that sort of thing is over. Now, as is tradition before Christmas, is Oxbridge interview season. My understanding is that there are students who have interviews as soon as Monday, and I expect some of you may already have had yours. If you have, it will be really interesting to hear about your experiences. So please do drop those into the Q&A later on so that we can get a sense of how things are going, because that's unbelievably valuable for everyone involved to know how things have been going so far. For those of you who aren't familiar faces, my name is Matt, and I look after the research side of things here at UniAdmissions. My role is to make sure that everything that we put out there in terms of ideas, in terms of strategies, tips that you see as well today, all of that is stuff that we can back up, that it has a nice R squared value to it, and that it works. So we are going to be talking this week, as I mentioned a second ago, about interviews. Some of you will have them on the horizon, which is very exciting. Some of you may already have had them, but that's where we're going to be focusing today. And as I mentioned a moment ago, since we're taking a couple of weeks off after this, I have no idea what we're doing next week. There may be no next week. Hopefully there will be, because I'm looking forward to the break. There certainly won't be an open day. So to kick things off, my first sort of interview tip, and hopefully this is one that you are all familiar with, is making sure that you really know your personal statement. This is an oddly underrated part of preparation for your interview. I speak with students every year who will have mentioned things on their personal statement that they have not read or they don't feel fully comfortable with. So this is a really effective area to improve things on. And I completely forgot to mention, which is very rude of me, that I'm joined this week by my colleague Rory. Hello, Rory. How are you?
That's better. Hello. Checking 1, 2. Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Hello, Rory. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, how are you?
Yeah, not bad. Our last open day of the year, and no one I would rather be spending it with.
Ditto. Absolutely.
So, as I was just saying, we're going to be talking a little bit about personal statements to start off with. You know, this is an easy piece of prep you can do. Get your personal statement out, print it back out. Hopefully you haven't lost it. And try and remember, because, it was 6-8 weeks ago, which is a long time. Why is it that you wrote the things that you wrote in the personal statement? Why did you choose the topics that you did choose? And if you were writing your personal statement again, what would you be doing differently? What of the texts that you picked are you still really interested in? What ideas have you kind of moved on from? And play around with the ideas that you've put in the personal statement. If you have written about the French Revolution, for example, practice a few obvious questions about that. See what you're going to do with the ideas that you've got from your personal statement, what new ideas you picked up since then, and just have a little bit of a practice with it and make sure that you're really comfortable with the stuff on your personal statement. The trick here is, and if we think from the interviewer's perspective, this makes a lot of sense. The stuff on the personal statement is stuff that you have volunteered. These are the things you've said, I would like to talk about this. I know all about this stuff. I would like to talk about it. Now, if it turns out you don't really want to talk about the things that you yourself have chosen, that's a bad sign. The personal statement is supposed to be a nice, easy set of questions that are comfortable and easy for you because you basically picked the questions. So make sure that any questions on the same material as your personal statement, you really know what you're doing because that's where your strength really should lie. And this is one, I don't know if you've spoken to anyone this year, Rory, but this is one that students get wrong every year, that they won't be quite ready for stuff.
So sorry, I didn't quite catch the question.
Yeah, this is one students find difficult every year, making sure they actually know their stuff from their personal statements.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I've been lots of students saying that they're going over reading it, and reading it's obviously very important because but it's also important not to sort of have too much sort of pre-prepared, don't rehearse. That's the whole point. Practice, but don't have, because they'll be able to tell that they're seeing hundreds of students a day. They'll be able to tell if it's pre-prepared. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's if you're pre-prepared, it can be very easy to throw you off in ways that aren't helpful as well. Right, so we've got a whole set of points. What is our next point? The next point, and this is a little sneaky, is all about knowing the marking scheme for the interview. You want to know what it is you're being tested on, what people care about, what the assessment is. Now, these 3 criteria, these are taken from the Oxford Internal Manual of How to Do an Interview. These are specifically those for PPE, but I've looked at a good number of these manuals and they are all pretty much the same. The 3 things they're really looking for, the first one is what they call application. That's your passion for the subject, your enthusiasm for tackling the questions that you're given in the interview, your overall interest, the kind of the sense that you want to do this not just in the interview, not just at school, but that you want to be doing this 10, 11 hours a day for the rest of your life as a researcher, as someone who's really passionate about the subject. That it's something you really like getting your teeth into. So that's kind of the motivation part. Then you have what they're calling here reasoning, and this is the kind of intellectual skill that you're able to take in new information, that you're able to develop a coherent argument that doesn't involve you contradicting yourself and doesn't end up getting stuck in dead ends, and that actually is an argument rather than you just going, some of this, some of that. They want you to have a real argument that you're making. And it's particularly important here if you are making an argument but then new information is presented to you that doesn't support your argument, that you're able to adapt what you're doing, that you don't find yourself trapped in a dead end or digging yourself into a hole because you're unwilling to change your mind. That's a mistake that students often make because they will assume that creating a good argument is the same as not changing your mind, and that really isn't the case here. If you've been given new information, if the evidence has changed, then it's really important that you can stop and go, okay, now taking that into account, obviously what I've been arguing before doesn't really make sense. So let's try something different. That's the kind of thoughtful response that you want to be giving, and that's going to really help in the interview. And the last part is the communication side of things. This, of course, is the really difficult bit. But if you imagine the first 2, your passion for the subject, your ability to reason, these are both hugely important. But if you can't communicate what you're trying to, if you can't communicate your passion, if you can't show your reasoning process, if you can't make a clear presentation of your ideas, it can be very difficult for the interviewers to judge whether the ideas are good or whether you're really passionate and invested in something. It'll all just look like a bit of a mess. And that's why communication really is the most important part, I think, because without it, the other parts don't come out as clearly. So yeah, be aware that's what you're being marked on, that it's not just about your enthusiasm and your ability, it's about being able to take something that you can do on a piece of paper and turn it into something that you can do face-to-face with someone else. And that's the really challenging part. My next big tip is about handling the questions. So we've been through the easy question, the personal statement. We have made sure we know what we're being marked on, so we know how to make sure that our answers are fitting it. The next thing to do is to know how to approach the questions. What I like to do, and people may have other approaches, but this is the one I'm going to try and share with you today, is to try and chop up the question. If you imagine that you were trying to eat a chicken, for example, Rory, if you were going to eat a chicken, how would you do it?
Well, I'd probably pick one part of it, start there, for example, the breast or the leg, depending on your preference. But yeah, you wouldn't sort of just pick up the whole thing and, go at it all in one go. It would probably...
you wouldn't want to shove it all in your mouth in one go.
No.
Particularly if you were going to eat the bones. Oh.
Exactly. Crucially,
crunchy bones.
Yeah.
I would what I do with those, I would give them not to a dog because they can choke dogs. I'd give them to a pig. I'd buy a pig and the pig could have the bones. Not a trouble. But what you want to do is, rather than trying to eat the chicken all at once, you want to break it up into the parts. And you want to do the same thing with these questions. You want to chop up the question into different pieces and figure out what's going on with each one of those pieces before you try and answer the whole question. This really helps for a number of reasons. The first is it means you know what you mean by each one of the ideas and what you're arguing for. If you don't take the time to figure out what each of the ideas you're working with means, you may find that your argument returns into a bit of a mess if it turns out that your meanings aren't precise enough, or if those meanings change, or if you don't fully understand what the meanings are. If you don't know what some of the words mean, if you want to try and explore some nuances, this is where the discussion part comes in. If you don't know what something is, you should ask. There are thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps even millions of words in English. No one is expecting you already know all of them. No one knows all of them. If you come across a word, an idea, a concept in your interview, you don't know what it is, you can say, oh, that one's a new idea to me. I don't fully know what that means. Would you mind explaining it to me? And they'll be like, sure. This is a teaching institution. We like helping people to understand things that they previously did not know. No one is going to be upset that you didn't know. There are any number of words or concepts you won't know what they are. That's the point of going to university, to find out. And this all goes towards as well, don't try and do the whole thing in the one step. Don't try and eat the whole chicken in one go. What you're trying to show, as we talked about in the previous step, you're trying to show that you know how to go through these reasoning processes, that you can communicate what you're doing to the interviewer. And so a lot of what they're looking for is showing how good you are at chopping up the chicken, how nicely you can separate the legs and the wings, how tidily you can understand each of the ideas. That really matters. So we're going to look at a couple of examples now, I think, unless I've got the order of my slides wrong. I know I have got a couple of examples. So I've got a broadly humanities-y, sciencey, social science politics-y question here, and also a question that is more of a hard science question. So, Rory, remind me, you're not a chemist, are you, by any chance?
I'm not a chemist by trade. No, unfortunately not.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's do that one first then, because that's more difficult. It'll be more of a challenge for us both. So let's look at this question. What would we change about the periodic table? Now, if I remember correctly, the periodic table, it's a whole bunch of boxes in a kind of sort of landscape setup, right?
I think so, yes, from what I can recall from my basic schooling, yeah.
And so all of those little boxes, each of them represent a different element, and they're arranged in a kind of pattern, right? Now, to the best of my knowledge, that isn't a setup that came down from the heavens as perfect, right? We sort of figured it out. So it's not the only way you could arrange them, right? You could, for example, you could have circles. You could have a layout that had more color to it. The periodic table normally shows up in black and white. You could decide that the thing you care about isn't the periodic table is arranged by atomic weight. You could decide that isn't what you care about. You might want to arrange it based on its prevalence on the Earth, for example. So one of the odd things about the periodic table is it gives equal size to each element, regardless of how much you bump into it. There's hydrogen and oxygen everywhere. But they get just as large a space on periodic table as something like, nobelium, which only exists for fractions of a second inside a particle accelerator. That seems silly. Maybe you want to rearrange that. The trick to this question is to understand the premise that we're working with, which is the periodic table. It doesn't have to be like that. It could be arranged differently. So the first question you want to ask yourself is, right, why is it the way it is? What decisions might have led to it being arranged the way it is? And this is a great chance to ask the question of the interviewer to say, okay, I'm not sure why it is that it is like it is now. Can you tell me anything about the history of the periodic table? How did they decide to make it like this? And you could begin a discussion there, thinking about different things that you might want to change, different areas of the periodic table you might want to put greater emphasis on. But the trick is to understand that what you're dealing with is something that human instruction, it's a convention. It needn't be like this. And so what you're trying to do is show that you understand the reasoning process as to how it came to be this way, but also to think about the alternative ways of arranging it that might lead to different advantages, different disadvantages, different emphases. And of course, it's all about this communication question, because what you're seeing there is you can understand what the arrangement of the periodic table as it is trying to communicate, and you can discuss what other things it might choose to communicate instead, or as well, or to take out. But let's move on to our second question and talk about violence. So, Rory, do you think that violent protests can ever be justified?
Well, I mean, I think if I was answering this question in an interview, I would sort of start by sort of saying, well, obviously there's violent protest and there's non-violent protest, and if one, I think non-violent protest can be justified, and you'd have to look at, again, my approach would be, looking at recent protests and what's gone on, and discussing whether they were justified, and if violence can ever be justified. And there's obviously you get into sort of moral relativism and that sort of rabbit hole, and so again I think you could get trapped in a sort of discussion of morals and what's right and wrong.
So what I'm going to suggest is let's do our chopping up a little bit. So our first question we're faced with then is, we've got four ideas here, I think. Our first idea is violence. Our second idea is protest. Then we've got ever, and we've got justification as well. So the first thing I want to look at is the last bit, ever justified. So we're not looking for justified all the time, not looking for justified most of the time. We're looking for can ever be justified. So one time in an infinite number of instances. It only needs to be justifiable once. And then I want to look at justification. Justifying, who are we justifying this to? Are we justifying it to God? Are we justifying it to people who disagree with us? Are we justifying it to the United Nations? Who is the person who is making this distinction around justice? We then want to come back up the top and look at violence. So what is violent protest? What is violence? If I throw a brick at you, I think that's probably violent. If I throw a tennis ball or a ping pong ball at you, is that violence? If I throw a brick at a shop, is that violence? If I throw a tennis ball at a shop, is that violence? If I say something really horrible to you, Rory, really horrible, does that get to be violence, or are we going to say that it's got to have some kind of physical dimension? So we're going to have to decide what violence is. And then we want to think about what counts as protest. I think probably what counts as protest is the least interesting part of this question, because I think once you've got the other parts to work, it becomes a lot easier. So my temptation here would be to say, okay, we're setting a very high bar. It needs to be justified ever, which sounds fairly straightforward to me. I think we can probably agree that sometimes it might be justified, not often, but sometimes. And And then we've got to think about what violence is. And I think that's the most interesting part of this question, is to get into that discussion about what counts as violence. And then you want to think as well about what counts as invalid kinds of protests, who get all these little pieces. You'll find that the question becomes that bit easier to answer, but also you've managed to find a whole bunch of other questions that you can turn into a discussion. Because I think probably the question of what counts as violence is more interesting than the question of whether violent protest can be justified. Because once you've figured out what violence is, it's going to change your answer to the other parts of the question. If you're setting a really high bar for violence, then you're going to be more worried, right? If violence is something really, really bad, then it's going to be harder to justify. But if you're saying violence could be something that's like bad, but not that bad, then maybe you're making it easier to justify. There's a lot of moving parts. And that's
I think also, sorry, Matt, I think, and when you break it down, you not only give yourself a bit of time to think, and you rather than panicking on giving them an answer straight away, breaking it down gives you avenues, and you might find yourself lost in one of the avenues, but then it brings you back into the original question and allows you to demonstrate that you know more than just the laws on non-violent protest, because you could just go again, you could get down the rabbit hole of legality and that sort of thing, but they're not looking for your knowledge of the law. They're looking for how you can work out an answer that you don't necessarily know straight away.
Yeah, there's a reason that these questions are always quite abstract. They won't want to rely on your knowledge, they'll want to rely on your reasoning. Speaking of your knowledge and your reasoning, my next tip is to make sure that you know a little bit about yourself before you go into these interviews. Everyone has a different way of presenting ideas. Think about how you do it. What is your preferred way of communicating with people? What kind of style do you adopt? What kind of way of arranging your ideas works well for you? If you can, see if you can draw a picture of it. Whether it's like a flow chart, whether it's a set of a bunch of arrows pointing in different directions, maybe it's some kind of graph. See if you can figure out how it is that you go about explaining things, how you go about figuring things out. Look at that process and see how you can make it clearer, make it easier for someone who doesn't know you to understand. You want to make sure that you know what you're doing so that you can better explain it to other people, because if you don't know how you're approaching the problem, it's going to be hard for you to communicate your approach to someone else because you don't really know what you're doing. Trying to diagram it out will tell you a lot. And as you're doing that, try and figure out what parts of the process you don't like. There will be bits of explaining it yourself you don't enjoy. Maybe you don't like having to ask questions. Maybe that makes you feel uncomfortable. Maybe you don't like being pushed back against. Maybe you don't like having to deal in really abstract questions. Maybe you like things to be pulled back to a real world example. That's very much me. Figure out what you find difficult and make sure that you are focusing on that in terms of your improvement, but also trying to compensate appropriately. If you know that you're going to find a particular part of the reasoning process difficult to communicate to someone else, make sure you're practicing that and make sure that you are aware that it's a difficult part, so that when it comes to it, you're not panicked because you're like, this is the part I find difficult. This hasn't come as a surprise to me. I know what I'm doing. And I think we'll go on to the next one of these. The fifth idea is practice. This probably doesn't come as a huge surprise to anyone. There is an urban myth that you will hear, a widespread misunderstanding that there are certain things in life you can't practice. One example of this is penalties in football. Hopefully, you've all been watching the World Cup, and one of the features of the World Cup as it goes on will be the penalty shootout. And there's this widespread belief that you can't practice because the circumstances, the pressure, the tension, the high stakes, all of that means that you can't practice for it because you can never practice how tense and how stressful it would be. Now, I personally think this is not true. You can't practice how stressful and frightening it will be, but you can practice every other part of it. You can practice the technique, you can practice your mental preparation, you can practice really everything apart from the situation. And so what hopefully will happen is you will get into the situation, and the situation will be stressful, but it will be the only part that's stressful. All the other stuff will be fine. You'll be like, all of this stuff, I know what I'm doing. It's stressful, but it's a stressful example of doing something that I'm fine with, rather than saying, I can't practice, I'll just turn up on the day and I'll wing it. And if it's really stressful, it's not like I could have practiced anyway. I don't know. Are you a football fan, Rory, or you have a bit of a rugby vibe? I'm going to admit.
Yes, and I do, but I'm also a football fan. In fact, I mean, I heard somewhere that I think the chance of scoring a penalty is 90%. I think, but because people get the pressure and the moment, and that they try and be clever, they mess it up. And actually, the most likely place to score is down the middle, rather than to the side, because the keeper normally jumps left or right. They try and guess, but yeah, there we go. A bit of factoid for you. I'm not sure what the word is, but yeah.
I suppose if you're the goalkeeper, you want to jump, because if you stay in the middle, it looks like you didn't do anything.
That's the thing, but also people are scared of heading it down the middle because it also looks like you didn't, they fear being looking silly as well. So again, practice would eliminate that. So there we go.
Yeah. So like I said, it's all a question of practice. You probably haven't had many interviews in your life, probably none like this one. You shouldn't expect that you're going to be brilliant at it. All you want to do is to practice with as wide a range of people as you can. Practice with who you like. Teachers will have if you have a family friend or an uncle or someone like that who can help you practice with them. Make sure that you are practicing with a range of different people, because what you don't want to do is practice with your one favorite teacher, and then it turns out that the interviewer is nothing like your one favorite teacher, and that throws you off. You want to practice feeling that it's uncomfortable and intimidating and you don't enjoy it, and it's horrible. You want to practice that. If you come into the interview and it's the first time it's ever been horrible, it'll throw you off, you'll panic, it'll make it much harder. You want to have already had the experience of it being horrible, so when it's horrible again, it's not such a horrible surprise.
Absolutely. No, definitely. And that's, but for those of you who don't know, we arrange mock interviews for students with different tutors, so that it's not someone you've got rapport with and you've built up, so that you're comfortable with this with a fresh face, just like it would be in the real thing, because that's obviously very important, getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to find someone outside of school, outside of your family, someone who is new and different and a little bit frightening, so that part of it is that you've been able to practice that part. This all gets down to what I like to call controlling the environment. This is particularly relevant with interviews, inexplicably, being online again this year. I'm so tired of them putting them online, it's silly. The nice thing about the interviews being online, though, is that you can control a lot of what I would really advise, and this is going to sound a little bit silly, figure out what you're going to do for your interview. Are you going to do it in your bedroom? Are you going to do it in the kitchen? And set up your laptop, make sure everything works, get it in the right part of the room, make sure the angles are okay so that your face can be seen properly. Practice whatever outfit you're going to wear. Practice walking in and out of the room, practice using the technology, have a practice interview, even if it's just with like a friend of yours, using the technology to practice what it's like. Really make sure that the only thing that's new when you get to the interview is the person you're talking to and the questions they're asking. If you're not familiar with the technology, if you're not sure about the room you're in, if you start up the call and no one can see your face because there's weird lighting, all of those things are going to throw you off. You want to avoid that by really practicing and figuring out the environment to work for you. This is an advantage you wouldn't have in the usual in-person interviews. The normal in-person interviews will be a place you've never been before, with someone we'd never met. It was a new, scary experience. Do it online. You can do it in your bedroom. You can do it all in an environment that you feel comfortable with, that you're in charge of, that you can feel relaxed in. So make sure you do. You don't want to be panicking over whether you can get Microsoft Teams to work. You want to have complete control over all that stuff. So make sure you've practiced and figure out what techniques in that context work for you. Some people like to wear shoes, even though they're at home indoors, for the interview. Some people like to go out of the house, wander around for a bit, then walk back in and pretend they've arrived at a new destination. Some people want to have a shower right beforehand. Some people will, make sure they've got some coffee with them. Whatever works for you, figure out what helps you to feel your best and in control of the situation. I don't wear shoes when I do these webinars, but I do, and this is one of my tips, is I have an absolutely huge supply of water with me. In fact, I can use the trick of the camera to make it look even bigger. Look at that. Cool. And that means if I ever want to take a break, I've got some props, I can relax, I can change my focus. Also why I have Rory here, because that way, if I get bored and my voice gets tired, I get him to say something.
Hello, like that, you see. It's very easy.
Like I say, this is a situation where you have an unusual amount of control over what it's going to be like. Make sure that you're taking advantage of all of those things. And finally, the final tips. That makes sense. Look at me making these slides in a logical order.
It's as if you've done it before.
Oh gosh, yeah. We'll talk about that later, but there are, I fear, maybe 100 hours of these you can go back and watch on YouTube. I wouldn't recommend it. I'd say that's too many hours, but they are there if you've really enjoyed my company today. Finally, some tips from experience. I had my interview at Oxford. It must be close to 13 years ago exactly now.
No, don't believe that, Matt.
No, you're right. It was 14 years. And as you can tell, I'm over it. Absolutely, completely over it. They didn't take me. And so I wanted to recap with a few specific things I remember from that I think can make sure you have read everything in your personal statement. I had on my personal statement a book I hadn't read yet. I did read it in time, but that was not a brilliant use of my last minute preparation time. I didn't need to put that book on there. I could have put whatever I wanted on my personal statement, but I made things difficult for myself for no reason. Don't do that. Where you do know about something, where you really have some kind of expertise or depth of knowledge, that should be the thing you talk about. If you get the opportunity to talk about the thing that you are really interested in, that you really know about, that you can really show that you have a really serious level of knowledge of, make sure you have the chance to do that. Again, I didn't do that on my personal statement. I didn't include stuff I really, really knew about. Mistake. Should have gone with the stuff that I really knew. You want to take your time. You're going to have half an hour. You can do enough work to be a fantastic student in like 10 minutes. You don't need to fill every one of those 30 minutes with you talking. If anything, the opposite. Take your time, stay calm, and push into your answers. You can have breaks, you can stop, you can say, do you mind if I have a little bit of think about that? I'm not totally sure where I'm going with that. You can pause, have a big drink. Whatever you do, don't panic into rushing into an answer, because what will happen, and this is what happened to me, is you'll just make something up. You'll just make something up. And unfortunately, because the people you're talking to are experts, they will know. They will know you're making things up because they know their stuff. And worst of all, they might go, oh, that thing you just made up. I've not heard that before. That's really interesting. Where did you hear that? Tell me more about that. And you go, oh no, I made that up. And now they're asking me questions about it. I have to make more stuff up. I look more and more like an idiot. Don't do that. The reason you're applying is because you're going there to learn. You don't know everything. If you knew everything, there would be no need to go to university. You're going there because you want to learn stuff. You're not going there to teach, to explain how things work, to show off what a smart person you are. You're going there because you want to find out new stuff, because you want to work with these people in a collaborative way, because they are smarter than you and you know that. Remember, that's what the point is. If you go in there and you're like, well, I am the smartest guy there is, they'll be like, oh, well, that's fine. That's the smartest guy there is. He doesn't need to come here. He'll be fine without us. Why would we give a place to the smartest guy? He won't get anything out of this experience. He already knows it all. No point having him. Be as humble and as interested and as curious as you can. No point in showing off more than you need to. It won't go well. And I think that brings us more or less to the end of our slides. So Rory is going to talk a little bit more about what we offer here at UniAdmissions, apart from these slides.
So at UniAdmissions, we help students like yourselves get into Oxford and Cambridge. We've been doing it for 10 years, and our bread and butter really are our premium programs. So obviously, I'm sure some of you will have your interview next week or the week after, and you should have got in touch last year or a few months ago, but that's all right. We like to work with students throughout the whole phase of the application process. If you click on the next slide, please. So the first part of our the way we help students is one-to-one tuition. Obviously, that's the best way to get the feedback and see exactly where you're going wrong. We would find a tutor who had done the same course at the same uni. Obviously, the best person to help you through that process and guide you through, whether it's your personal statement, your admissions test, your interview, we can help with all of that. We also have our online materials and resources. So UniAdmissions are sort of right at the front in terms of at the top of the pile, all sorts of metaphors for having the most amount of resources. Not only do we have the ones publicly available, but we come up with our own mock papers and exclusive mock past papers and things like that, using our experience of having done it for so long. We have timed questions on our student portal. You can submit essays for marking by our tutor pool, things like that. Reading lists to explore wider areas in the subject. Video series on the subject as well. So a huge amount of resources to get on with when you're not with your tutor. There's a program guide, so you know exactly what to study and when, a syllabus and a curriculum just like you would have at school. So you know all the content, you practice it, and then you do time tests as well. The third part of our, if I can have the next slide please, is our enrichment seminars. Basically, it's a fancy word for a university level lecture. So obviously you're doing your A-level subjects and you're at that sort of level, but we introduce you to a university level discussion and debate and enrichment, because basically it's there to increase and deepen your motivation for the subject. And it also helps you prepare for the interview because you're discussing and debating with other students who might, someone might say something ridiculous and you've got to debate with them. And again, it's just getting you comfortable with thinking like an Oxford or like a Cambridge student. And having these sort of high level discussions. And then finally, we have our intensive courses. So some are 1 day, some are 2 day, depending on the course and depending on exactly what you're doing. So we have personal statement intensive courses, admissions test intensive courses, and an interview as well. Although actually the last interview intensive course is this weekend, so it's a bit too late for that, but there is next year's. And these are there to consolidate all the work you've done with your tutor or in your own time. They're positioned close to each application hurdle to give you that last boost of confidence, check where you can compare with your peers, because this is group work basically. So you're split into groups and you have a sort of formed tutor who'll go through all the all the important information for whatever that intensive course is. So it's just a last minute boost. They're really effective and they're really, it's useful learning off your peers because you can see where everyone else is as well. So those 4 parts come together to increase your chance of Oxbridge success by about, 3 times on average. We've been doing this, as I said, for 10 years. And yes, I said 61% is we're 3 times higher than the national average. Last year, we got 2/3 of our students in, and particularly medicine is really our bread and butter. And that's what we sort of started off doing, which is why we're so good at getting people into medical schools. So not just Oxford and Cambridge. So no matter what uni you're applying for, as long as there's an interview, an admissions test, or some difficult process, we can help. And if you would like to, I'm one of the admissions consultants. My name's Rory, and I'm sure my details will be somewhere if you'd like to get in touch and have a consultation or find out more about the services, because we'd love to help.
Yes, that's what I'm going to talk about now, actually.
Oh, fantastic.
As Rory said, we're really proud of our success rates. They compare very flatteringly with even some of the more expensive schools in the country. We don't quite have the outfits of Eton, but we like to think that we have comparable results, which we do. Pity about the outfits, though. I've been trying to convince it right around about the one for years.
I've still got my old one. I could bring it in one day, I'm sure. We can all try it
on. We also have a good record on Trustpilot, and I really encourage anyone who has enjoyed this open day to drop us a review over there. No one has yet left a review saying how handsome I am. And if you do, I will put that right here in our slides for next year. And every webinar, every week, seen over the course of the year by thousands of people, will include your review. It does have to say how handsome I am. Them's the rules. You can also learn more about the process from our podcast, in which Rohan and Will are discussing everything from admissions test through to the zombie apocalypse. That's my favorite episode. Have finally invited me to appear on the podcast, so I no longer have to say it's bad, because now I have been invited on, so I like it. I'm very jealous. For up until we will take some questions. Be a little animated. If you drop your questions into the Q&A box, we will do our best to answer them. My only warning is that many of the kinds of questions we want to ask will be quite detailed, and it is very difficult for me to look up detailed information while also doing this PowerPoint presentation. So in that case, please do book a consultation with us so we can have a proper conversation. We can actually research the answer to your questions. We can get out our big spreadsheets, figure out what the real answers are, because the last thing I want to do is for us to give you incomplete information that might be a little bit wrong, information that might be misleading, because we're in a hurry and because we haven't got the right resources at our fingertips here while we're doing PowerPoint. And that's what makes the consultation so valuable. It's a chance to have a proper conversation, really understand what you need, how we can help, and to sort of build on things from there. Have you spoken to anyone particularly interesting of late, Rory? Because you're the one who's on the consultation, it's not me. They don't let me out of my spreadsheet dungeon.
Well, I mean, obviously we have lots of students at this time of year who have their interview next week or in the coming weeks, who are panicking because they haven't done any prep so far, because again they thought, oh well, I've read my personal statement, then that's really enough. It's a conversation, so obviously you need to practice by having conversations. And we get the odd person trying to work out if their room at St Catherine's College will have a fridge in it, which I can't really help with. But I say, we'll throw in a fridge if they get some support with us. So yes, the best way is to have a free consultation. There's no pressure at that stage. There's no commitment at all. So we'd love to chat and see what we can do to help.
Yeah, I think it's particularly valuable for students who are thinking about applying in 9 months' time in a new window, and also for students who are thinking about reapplying. This is something I've done a lot of research into of late. What we found is that the reapplication rate for students, so the chances of success, are somewhat higher the second time round, and particularly if you add on to that the impact of the work we're able to do. If things don't go well for you in the next 2 or 3 weeks, if it is what you've really got your heart set on, it's worth considering taking having a second go round, because the statistics are fairly favorable, and it's something that we've had really good success with over the last few years, students who are applying for the second time. It makes for some subjects, I think it's, as much as an extra, going from a 15% chance to a 25% chance. So, a really big difference in a few subjects that second time round. Oh, well, it appears that this has been an unprecedentedly successful webinar because no one has asked a question. I must have answered all the questions earlier on, which I'm delighted about. So that'll give me 11 minutes to get myself ready for the football. And I'll be ready so early, I'll have the opportunity to sing the Star Spangled Banner, and my wife will hate it because I'm a very bad singer. It's a very difficult song. I think we'll call it a day there. Thank you so much, Rory, for joining me this week.
Not at all. I was wondering. I mean, I could perhaps put my email in the chat box, and if someone wanted to get in touch, they could do that, or go through the booking form online, of course.
Oh, we'll leave them with the form. Otherwise, you'll be inundated with
that's true with fan mail. Yeah, exactly. I thought so. Yeah.
All right then. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Have a lovely end of the year, a Christmas, a New Year, whatever other cultural practices you enjoy, and very best of luck in the World Cup, unless you come up against England, in which case, boo, boo. And we'll see you all in the new year. Thank you very much.